You want to get your head around the big stuff, right? Like understand these complex issues without needing a law degree.
Yeah, that's a goal.
Well, that's what we're all about here. Think of this as your personal shortcut to grasping a really significant and honestly quite evolving issue.
And today, we're diving deep into the UK Supreme Court's recent ruling. It's all about how the term woman is legally defined under the Equality Act 2010.
Right, and what that actually means for transgender rights, it's complicated.
It really is, and it's got huge implications.
Exactly. So to get the full picture, we've pulled together a range of sources. We've got a House of Commons library briefing paper, the official stuff on gender recognition.
And the Supreme Court's own press summary of the case itself, the For Women Scotland versus the Scottish Ministers case. That's key.
Definitely. Plus, responses from groups like Transactual, Stonewall. We've even looked at a Reddit discussion on R2X chromosomes to get a sense of, wider public reaction.
And news coverage, too, right? From different outlets like the Daily Mail, Fox News, even a live update from The Independent. Plus, a general explainer on UK equality law.
Yeah, a real mix. So our goal today is to basically cut through the noise.
Yeah, extract the crucial bits. What's the core of this ruling? What are the different viewpoints?
And importantly, what might it all mean going forward? That's what we want to help you understand.
Okay, let's get started then.
Right. So first things first. What did the Supreme Court actually decide? What's the absolute core of this ruling?
Okay, so on April 16th, 2025, the UK Supreme Court ruled unanimously, and they said that the term sex, as it appears in the Equality Act 2010, it refers to biological sex.
Biological sex. Okay. And this came out of that specific case you mentioned, For Women Scotland.
Exactly. It was an appeal by For Women Scotland against the Scottish ministers. The background is this Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018.
Ah, the one aiming to get more women onto public boards in Scotland.
That's the one. And the question was how woman should be defined for that act. FWS challenged the initial approach.
I see. So the Supreme Court looked at the Equality Act to clarify things for the Scottish Act.
Sort of. They specifically looked at how defining woman in the Scottish Act, by reference to having a gender recognition certificate, or GRC, interacted with the Equality Act.
Okay.
And the court basically said, look, if you interpret sex in the Equality Act to mean certificated sex, so your legal sex, after getting a GRC, it messes things up.
Messes things up how?
It would create, and this is their word, incoherent definitions of man and woman within the Equality Act itself, because the act uses sex in other contexts, too.
Right, because the Gender Recognition Act lets people legally change their gender. For all purposes, wasn't that the idea?
Well, for all purposes was the phrase used, yes. But the Supreme Court is now saying that getting a GRC, getting that legal recognition of your acquired gender, it does not change your sex, as defined in the Equality Act when we're talking about sex-based protections.
Wow, okay. So a clear line drawn there based on biological sex for the Equality Act's definition.
That's the core finding, yeah.
But hang on, what about the protections that transgender people do have under the Equality Act? Does this ruling affect those?
That's a really, really crucial point. And the answer is technically no. The Equality Act 2010 still protects transgender people from discrimination based on the characteristic of gender reassignment.
Okay, so that protection remains untouched.
Correct. The court drew a distinction. They talked about biological sex on one hand and certified sex, the GRC status, on the other.
But did they define biological sex? That seems like it could be complicated.
Good question. And no, the press summary, at least, doesn't provide a specific legal definition of biological sex.
Oh.
And that lack of definition is actually a major source of concern and criticism in the reactions we'll get to later. What does it mean? Chromosomes, anatomy, hormones. It's left open.
Right. So you can't discriminate based on gender reassignment, but for things specifically protected based on sex.
Yes. Like single-sex services, for example. The Equality Act already had provisions allowing single-sex services to exclude transgender people.
If it's a proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim. I remember that bit.
Exactly. Like, say, a domestic violence refuge for women might argue that maintaining a female-only space is necessary for the safety and recovery of its users.
Okay.
This ruling doesn't change that provision exists, but it clarifies that the basis for defining the sex in single sex, in that context, relates back to biological sex.
Understood. So inevitably, this ruling has caused, quite a reaction. Very different reactions, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Starkly different, you could say.
Let's start with For Women Scotland. Since they brought the appeal, How did they respond?
Well, as you might expect, they saw it as a major victory, a win for women's rights in their view.
Okay.
They felt it upheld what they call the ordinary meaning of the word sex, biological female, and that it safeguards sex-based rights for women.
So validation for their position, essentially.
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, now flip the coin. What about transgender activists and advocacy groups? What's the feeling there?
Deep concern, disappointment, anger in some cases. Transsexual, for instance, put out a strong response.
What were their main points?
They highlighted, like we just discussed, that the ruling distinguishes between biological and certified sex, but doesn't actually define either term legally.
Right, the ambiguity problem.
Exactly. They called the court's approach an anti-scientific binary view of sex, arguing it ignores the complexities recognized by science.
And did they mention the Gender Recognition Act?
Oh, yes. Big time. They expressed serious concern that this ruling effectively undermines the GRA. If your GRC doesn't change your sex for all purposes, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, that creates uncertainty, doesn't it? Like for marriage, inheritance, pensions, all areas where sex might be relevant in law.
Precisely. It could lead to this kind of two-tiered system, creating legal limbo in various situations. That's the fear.
Did transsexual suggest any next steps?
They did. They called on both the UK and Scottish governments to step up and reaffirm their commitment to protecting trans and non-binary people.
A call for political reassurance.
Yes, and they also urged allies to actively resist any discrimination that might follow, and called for solidarity within the wider LGBTQ+ community.
Makes sense. And what about that Reddit discussion you mentioned, RT2X chromosomes? What was the vibe there?
A lot of worry, definitely. People expressing fears that this is a step backward for civil rights generally.
Not just trans rights, but civil rights.
Yeah, some framed it that way.
Yeah.
There were also concerns about potential negative impacts on women's rights, perhaps paradoxically.
How so?
Concerns were raised that focusing strictly on a potentially narrow definition of biological sex could lead to increased scrutiny or challenges for, say, cisgender women who don't conform to traditional gender presentations.
Yeah, I see. Like someone might be challenged using a women's bathroom if they don't look feminine enough.
That kind of thing, yes. Increased policing of gender expression, basically, and just making life harder for anyone gender nonconforming.
Okay. We also saw statements from bigger organizations like Stonewall.
Yes. Stonewall described the ruling as worrying. But they also made a point of noting that the court did reaffirm the existing Equality Act protections against discrimination based on gender reassignment.
So acknowledging the negative, but also highlighting the existing protection.
In a more measured tone, perhaps. We also saw individual activists speaking out, like Monroe Bergdorf, expressing disappointment and calling for solidarity.
Any other specific reactions? Political, legal interpretations?
Well, on the political side, Labor MP Nadia Whittam tweeted her deep disappointment and solidarity with the trans community.
Okay.
And legally, we saw comments from an employment lawyer, Hannah Ford. She suggested that while the ruling might provide some clarity on this specific legal point, it could be seen as a setback for transgender rights overall. She mentioned it might lead to an uphill battle for trans people seeking workplace inclusion.
An uphill battle. That sounds significant.
It does. So pulling all these reactions together, you can really see the main points of friction, can't you?
Yeah, definitely. It seems to boil down to a few key areas of, well, disagreement and uncertainty.
Absolutely. First, as we've said, that lack of clear legal definitions for biological uncertified sex, that's huge.
Right. Then the whole question of whether this ruling guts the Gender Recognition Act, or at least weakens it significantly.
Precisely. And the practical implications, what does this actually mean for accessing single-sex spaces and services day to day? That's a massive area of concern.
And tied into that, the wider worry is about increased discrimination, not just against trans people, but potentially against anyone who doesn't fit neat gender boxes.
Yeah, those are the core tensions this ruling seems to have amplified.
Okay, so we're seeing these really strong reactions, both positive and negative. And I think to really understand the weight of it all, it helps to put it in context, doesn't it? This ruling didn't just appear out of thin air.
Not at all. It builds on decades of law and shifting societal understanding around sex and gender in the UK. It's worth taking a quick step back.
Good idea. Where does this legal story really begin?
Well, the foundation was arguably the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975. Back then, man and woman were generally understood in biological terms.
Okay, straightforward enough for the time.
Then things started to shift. In 1999, we got the Gender Reassignment Regulations. This came after a key European court case, PVS, and Cornwall County Council.
Right. That case established protections against discrimination based on gender reassignment.
Exactly. It amended the Sex Discrimination Act to include those protections. But crucially, it didn't fundamentally change the underlying definitions of man and woman in the act.
Then the big one, the Gender Recognition Act, 2004.
Yeah, the GRA. Seen as really groundbreaking at the time, it allowed trans people to apply for legal recognition of their affirmed gender.
And it used that phrase for all purposes, right?
It did, yes. A person granted a GRC was considered legally to be of their affirmed gender for all purposes, though there were some specific exceptions listed.
But now we see that for all purposes is being interpreted more narrowly, at least in relation to the Equality Act's definition of sex.
That seems to be the effect of this Supreme Court ruling, yes. The interaction between the GRA and pre-existing legislation like the Equality Act is where the complexity lies.
And the Equality Act 2010 is the current main framework.
That's right. It consolidated all the previous equality laws, including protections based on both sex and gender reassignment as separate characteristics.
Okay, so that's the legal backdrop. And this specific case involving for women Scotland, it has its own history, too.
It does. This wasn't their first legal challenge. There have been ongoing debates and consultations about potentially reforming the GRA itself, both in Scotland and England, Wales. That's part of the context.
The proposed reforms that didn't really go anywhere in England, but Scotland had its own bill.
Exactly. And for women, Scotland has been particularly active in challenging how woman is defined in Scottish legislation, like that Public Boards Act we mentioned.
Were there earlier court cases?
Yes, there was a previous ruling by the Inner House of the Court of Session in Scotland, which found some related guidance unlawful. So this Supreme Court case is the culmination of those earlier stages.
Okay. And you mentioned another bill briefly, sentencing guidelines. Is that related?
Yeah, the Sentencing Guidelines Pre-Sentence Reports Bill. It's kind of adjacent. It touches on using personal characteristics in sentencing guidance, which involves sex and gender identity. But it's not directly about defining woman in the same way as this Supreme Court case, just part of the broader landscape.
Gotcha. So history covered, reactions unpacked. Let's look forward. What are the potential ripple effects? What could this actually mean on the ground moving forward?
Well, the biggest immediate thing is probably uncertainty, especially around those single-sex spaces and services. How will service providers interpret and apply this ruling?
Yeah, will policies change? Will there be more challenges or confusion at the point of access?
It's very possible. We might see more legal challenges, actually, as people try to test the boundaries and get clarity on how this ruling interacts with those existing anti-discrimination protections for gender reassignment.
It feels like clarification is definitely needed.
It does. And that ties into Transaxual's call for legislative action, doesn't it?
Right. They want governments to step in and perhaps amend laws to explicitly strengthen protections for trans and non-binary people in light of this.
That seems like a likely push from advocacy groups now. They'll argue the court's interpretation necessitates new legislation to uphold the spirit of the GRA and ensure clear rights.
And what about those concerns from the Reddit thread? The potential for increased scrutiny or harassment?
That's a real worry being voiced. That this ruling, by emphasizing biological sex, might inadvertently embolden prejudice or lead to more confrontational situations for anyone perceived as not fitting in based on their gender presentation.
Whether they're trans or cisgender.
Exactly. And the Daily Mail reporting, noting some activists feel this pushes trans rights back 20 years. That highlights the strength of feeling that this is a significant setback.
Okay, so quite a lot of potential fallout and uncertainty there. Let's try and crystallize the main takeaway for everyone listening. If you remember one thing from this deep dive, what should it be?
I think the absolute core takeaway is this. The UK's highest court has now determined that, for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010, the protected characteristic of sex means biological sex.
Right, and that has direct implications for how woman is legally defined when we're talking about protections based specifically on sex under that act.
Yes. And crucially, this applies even if someone has legally changed their gender and holds a gender recognition certificate. The GRC doesn't override the Equality Act's definition of sex in this specific context.
But, and this is the really important but, the Equality Act still prohibits discrimination based on gender reassignment. That protection is separate and remains in place.
Absolutely critical to remember that. Those two protections, sex and gender reassignment, coexist in the Act. However,
how they now interact, particularly around things like single-sex exceptions, is where the uncertainty and the debate really lies following this ruling.
Precisely. The interplay between those two aspects is going to be subject to interpretation and likely further legal and political argument.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How the same legal text, the same ruling can be seen so differently. A victory for some, a worrying setback for others.
It really throws into sharp relief the different ways people understand and prioritize concepts like sex and gender and equality.
Yeah.
There isn't one single perspective here.
Definitely not. And the strength of the reactions we've seen from FWS celebrating to transsexuals' deep concerns, the political comments, the online discussions, it shows just how deeply felt this issue is.
Yes, it underscores the sheer complexity and sensitivity. This ruling hasn't simplified things. Arguably, it's added another layer to already very challenging conversations about rights and identity in the UK today.
So, maybe a final thought to leave people mulling over. Considering everything we've discussed about this ruling,
Yeah.
what are the real fundamental distinctions we need to make between someone's legal gender recognition, like a GRC, their own internal lived sense of identity, and, well, their biological characteristics, however those are defined?
That's a huge question. How do those three things relate or not relate in law and in life?
Exactly. And how might wrestling with these distinctions shape future debates about equality, about rights, not just here in the UK, but potentially elsewhere, too?
It's definitely something to reflect on. The human impact behind these legal definitions is immense.
Absolutely. A lot to think about there as these complex issues continue to evolve.